This waiter felt he could get away with it till the entire cafe went silent. The door swung wide and a light breeze followed Tasha Williams inside. She hardly noticed that her mind was still running through the contents of her last meeting, contracts, discussions, deadlines. Just another day at the firm. She needed a break, just 20 minutes to sip a caramel latte and breathe before heading back into the chaos of her inbox. The cafe wasn't one she normally visited. It was tucked away in a quiet part of Scottsdale, Arizona. Upscale, polished, the kind of place where the scent of imported espresso beans mixed with hushed conversations about stock portfolios and summer homes. It wasn't exactly her crowd, but she didn't care. Coffee was coffee. She tightened the strap of her leather handbag and approached the counter. The barista, a young lady with a friendly grin, was busy creating drinks, but standing next to her was someone else, a man mid-20s, slender with a sharp jawline and a uniform that appeared a little too tight on him. His name tag read Dylan. Dylan wasn't smiling. His eyes flicked over her, first to her face, then down to her crisp white blouse and tailored slacks. A slight smirk curled at the corner of his mouth, something condescending, almost amused. Tasha knew that look. She had seen it in boardrooms and high-end boutiques, in the eyes of people who thought they could guess everything about her with just a glance. She ignored it. "I'll have a caramel latte," she remarked, keeping her tone nice but firm. Dylan didn't react right away. He just gazed at her, as if waiting for her to say something more. When she didn't, he exhaled through his nose, almost a scoff, before eventually putting in the order. "That'll be $650, he said plainly. Tasha tapped her card on the reader. "No thank you, no, have a nice day." Just silence. She wasn't ready for a fight, not today, not over something as trivial as bad service. So she collected her receipt and stepped aside, allowing her gaze wander over the cafe while she waited. Plush leather chairs, marble countertops, shelves lined with overpriced bags of gourmet beans, the kind of place that prided itself on exclusivity. She wondered how many people here actually wanted her inside. But then, before she could push that thought away, she felt that eyes watching her. She turned slightly and caught Dylan staring again. This time there was no smirk, just something colder, something that made the air seem a little heavier, yet she had no idea exactly how far this was going to go. Asha exhaled slowly, shaking off the moment she had dealt with men like Dylan before, arrogant, smug, carrying themselves with an undeserved sense of superiority. She wasn't about to let a barista with an attitude ruin her afternoon. She moved toward a small table by the window, setting her handbag down carefully before easing into the seat outside. The Arizona sun painted long golden stripes across the street, the kind of late afternoon radiance that made everything appear picture perfect inside the cafe hummed with low conversations. A group of middle-aged men in golf polos joked over cappuccinos. In the corner, a woman in designer sunglasses worked hard on her laptop. Near the pastry case, a pair of teenagers scanned through their phones, barely speaking. Tasha peered toward the VIP section, toward the rear, a cordoned-off area with luxurious velvet chairs and little gold-plated table numbers. Just two folks sat there, a sharply dressed man in his 60s and a woman in a sleek black suit. They spoke in low, measured tones, their expressions unreadable. She didn't think much of them. Instead, she pulled out her phone, scrolling through her emails as she waited for her drink. A few urgent messages from colleagues, a reminder about an upcoming deposition, an invitation to a networking event she wasn't sure she had the energy to attend. Just as she was about to reply to one of the emails, a sharp clink snapped her attention back to the present. Her coffee had arrived, only something was off. Dylan hadn't simply laid the cup down. He had dropped it against the table with enough force that the wine sloshed against the lid, a few droplets pouring over the dark wood. Tasha lifted her eyes, slowly meeting his stare. He didn't look away. Her fingers curled around the cup, her grip tightening slightly. "Everything okay?" she said, her voice even. Dylan shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Maybe you should stick to fast food places." It was silence, so quiet that for a moment she wasn't sure she had heard him right. Her lips parted slightly, more out of surprise than anger. She wasn't stranger to microaggressions, but this was something else. She let the words sink for a moment before responding. "What did you just say?" Dylan's smirk widened just a touch. He leaned in slightly, as if trying how far he could push. "I remarked, maybe you should stick to fast food places." The air in the cafe moved. A few nearby customers peered over, sensing something, but wondering whether they should get involved. Tasha sat back in her chair, tilting her head as she studied him. She could have walked away, could have ignored him, but something in the way he looked at her, something in the deliberate calmness of his insult, made her decide otherwise. And that's when things took a turn. A sharp, uncomfortable silence filled the space between them. Tasha Let the weight of his words settle. She had spent years navigating rooms full of people like Dylan, people who believed they could put her in her place with nothing more than a few well-placed words. She could feel the shift in the cafe. Now the golf clubmen in the corner had paused their conversation. The woman with the laptop had glanced up briefly before pretending to focus on her screen. No one said anything, but they were listening. Tasha exhaled through her nose a slow, measured breath. "I don't recall asking for your opinion," she replied, lifting the cup and dusting up the spilled droplets with a napkin. Her voice was steady, controlled. Dylan shrugged, unaffected, "Just saying, not sure this place is your kind of spot." The smirk never left his face. He wanted a reaction. That much was clear. Tasha had encountered this kind of subtle provocation before, the kind meant to push her just enough to make her snap, so people could turn around and call her the problem. But she didn't snap. Instead, she smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "That's interesting," she said, stirring her coffee casually, "because last time I checked, my money is the same color as everyone else's." A flicker of something passed over Dylan's face, annoyance, maybe even frustration. He hadn't expected her to stay this composed, but he wasn't done before she could take a sip. He took a step nearer and lowered his voice just enough so that she was the only one who could. Tasha put the cup down carefully, her heartbeat steady, but her patience gone. She looked him in the eye and said, "Hey, you always want to act like you belong somewhere you don't." And then the underlying tension broke through. Dylan opened his mouth again, but before he could repeat himself, another voice cut through the air, asking, "Is there a problem here?" A manager in his mid-40s, tall and well-groomed, with the cafe's insignia sewn across his breast, his eyes darting between them and his brows slightly wrinkled. Dylan's entire manner changed, the arrogance dissolving into something nearly professional. And he continued, "I'm just taking care of a customer," without flinching at all. Tasha may have forgiven him for being naive and making her appear challenging, but he did something inappropriate after realizing what he was doing. Dylan returned his focus to her, and for a brief moment, she hoped he would let it go, move away, and act as though nothing had happened. However, with a look so casual it bordered on boredom, he reached for a coffee and tipped it over as the scene slowed down. A wave of reprimanding caramel latte smashed on Tasha's white blouse, spilling into the fabric and leaving it dark brown. Gasps echoed through the cafe as the cup fell sideways, its lid popping off on impact. Tasha sucked in a breath, fighting the impulse to leap to her feet, her fingers clenched around the edge of the table. But she didn't flinch, refusing to give him that satisfaction. The manager's eyes widened in horror as Dylan's smirk grew. "What the hell, Dylan?" he said, stepping back as if he had just knocked over a salt shaker rather than pouring hot coffee on a customer. "My hand slipped," he said mockingly, as the cafe fell into a stunned silence. Even the men in the corner, who had been ignoring everything up until this point, stopped pretending not to watch. Tasha's mind racing. Tasha got up slowly and picked up a napkin from the table to pat the wet cloth. The stain wasn't coming out at this time, so she had two choices. She could publicly yell at him as he deserved to be treated, but she knew how that would go, and the moment she did, she would be the irate black woman causing a scene, or she could leave and walk out. He wasn't worth it, she told herself, but that wasn't an option either, because people like Dylan relied on women like her to remain silent. Tasha leveled her gaze at him and spoke in a calm but cold tone. "You really think you can get away with this?" she asked, crossing his arms with a smug confidence that never left his face. "I think you're making a big deal out of nothing," she said. A chair scuffed the floor, and a figure slowly got to his feet. The cafe changed, and Dylan noticed as well, because all of a sudden that arrogance vanished. The tall, broad-shouldered man from the VIP section, wearing a sharp gray suit, approached them calmly and composedly, but his presence alone changed everything, and Dylan felt the blood drain from his veins the moment he saw his face, because this wasn't just any man. This was Judge William Carter, Tasha's father, and Dylan had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The cafe was silent. Dylan's stance tensed, and his fingers twitched slightly on his apron as he swallowed hard. His smugness was judged. William Carter took his time and strolled with a swagger that commanded respect without having to be asked. His eyes were piercing and harsh, and his demeanor was inscrutable. Tasha could sense her father's presence behind her without even turning around. The change in the space, the silent power that followed him wherever when Dylan at last found his voice, His Adam's apple bobbed. "Sir, I judge." Carter made a small gesture with his hand, but it was sufficient, and Dylan clamped his mouth shut. The judge then turned to face Tasha, his face softening slightly as he observed the coffee seeping into her blouse, then turned back to face Dylan, and suddenly the softness vanished. "Did you just throw coffee on my daughter?" His voice was low, even without anger or a raised tone, but somehow that made it worse. Dylan retreated, and I guess it was an accident. The judge arched an eyebrow, glanced at the coffee-covered table and the empty cup resting on its side, then turned to face the manager. Was the manager visibly shaken? He inhaled deeply. "I'm not sure what to say, sir. I judge. I asked you a question," and Carter didn't flinch. The guy paused, glanced at Dylan, then at Asha, and then sighed. "No, sir, it wasn't an accident." "What's not that you poured hot coffee on a customer, judge?" Dylan's breath caught. Carter interrupted him, his voice steady, and Tasha folded her arms while she watched Dylan's face go completely white. The judge then surprised everyone by reaching into his suit pocket and taking out his business card, placing it on the counter with the same purposeful composure. "My office will be in contact," he said simply, as Dylan's hands curled into fists. "You can't," the judge said, tilting his head slightly. "I can wait heavy." Dylan's lips opened and then closed. He was aware that William Carter, a federal judge now with a lengthy record of resolving cases involving misbehavior and prejudice, was a powerful and influential man, and Dylan was only a barista who believed he could publicly humiliate a lady and escape punishment. Carter didn't need to say anything more, but the message was clear. Dylan wasn't going to leave this alone, and he realized for the first time. Dylan stood with his hands clenched at his sides, his lips slightly open as though he wanted to protest, but nothing came out, and his confidence entirely destroyed. The cafe manager cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Judge Carter," I began, but the judge hardly gave him credit. Dylan was the main focus. Tasha moved closer, her arms still folded around her shattered shirt. The coffee's heat had long since subsided, but the scene was etched in her mind. For a brief minute, she reflected on all the time she had ignored things, swallowed her rage, smiled through the rudeness, and left to maintain harmony. "This time, I want him fired," she declared simply, her voice echoing across the cafe. Dylan's head jerked in her direction, but the judge didn't even flinch. He turned to face the manager, his face unreadable, and asked, "What's your policy on employees who assault customers?" The manager appeared extremely uncomfortable, looking at Dylan, the judge, and then at Tasha before letting out a slow, defeated sigh. "Take off your apron, Dylan." The manager patted Dylan's forehead, saying, "You can't be serious. We have a zero-tolerance policy for such behavior, but please remove your apron." Reluctantly, Dylan untied the apron and pulled it over his head. He held it too tightly for a moment, as if he still had some control. Then he threw it onto the counter with shaking hands. Dylan froze, his fingers hovering near the knot tied at his back, his eyes darting around as if seeking assistance. No one spoke for him. Not the men in the corner, not the woman with the laptop, not even the teenagers who had stopped scrolling to watch everything unfold because no one was by his side. Tasha watched him to see if he would apologize or even show a glimmer of regret. Dylan's jaw tightened and his lips formed a thin line before he turned and left without saying another word. The bell over the door jingled as he went, and then it was over, or at least it's what everyone else believed. However, Tasha wasn't finished yet because Dylan wasn't just losing his job. He was also going to experience the real repercussions. The cafe door closed behind Dylan, but the weight of what had happened was still heavy. Tasha sat down again and used a fresh napkin to dab at her blouse. She wasn't angry about the coffee anymore, because it was only temporary. The manager paused before speaking to Miss Williams, saying, "On behalf of the cafe, I sincerely apologize for what just happened." His voice wavered as though he knew that an apology alone wouldn't suffice, saying, "Equally, your hiring decisions are your responsibility." The manager swallowed. "I understand if there's anything we can do, Judge," Carter stated in a forceful voice as he took out his phone and pressed a few keys. "Please don't repeat what I've already said. By tomorrow, you'll hear from my office. We require surveillance video, staff records, and any prior complaints regarding Dylan, the manager, having a face devoid of color. A coworker sent Tasha a message on her buzzing phone that said, "You're trending." When she viewed the video, her heart skipped a beat. She glanced up and scanned the cafe, where several phones were still filming after Dylan tipped the coffee over. By this point, the video had already gone viral online. Carter looked at her screen, his face inscrutable. "You can guess what happened next." Tasha nodded, and she was correct. "It won't be about me anymore." By the time Tasha arrived home, the fallout was already happening. The video, which was titled "Damning Racist Waiter Throws Coffee at a Black Woman, Then Finds Out Who Her Father Is," had gone viral, and the comments were vicious. "I hope she sues the man because you could tell it was over when he walked up." When you target the wrong person, the news picks it up, local stations play the film, morning talk programs analyze it, and people flood the cafe's social media with demands. You'd best have a lawyer on rapid dial. The next day, Dylan's complete identity and background were made public. It turned out that this wasn't the first time that this had happened, and the cafe's owner was compelled to make a statement separating the company from Dylan and pledging a thorough review of recruiting practices. Tasha saw it all happen, her phone ringing with calls for interviews, messages from activists, and even legal questions, but she knew what she was going to do next. She wasn't just watching this happen online. She was pursuing legal action because people like Dylan needed to understand that their actions had repercussions. Tasha realized that this wasn't just about a cup of coffee. It was about power, about who gets to act without consequence and who is expected to endure. A week later, she was sitting in her office looking through emails from civil rights attorneys who had reached out and offered support for the case against the cafe, which was moving forward not just for her, but for anyone who had been in her position and forced to remain silent. Dylan had believed that he could humiliate her and leave, but he was mistaken. He had assumed that the lawsuit would guarantee that no company could ignore discrimination under the pretext of poor service, that no one else would have to sit there with coffee dripping down their clothes, and that no one else would have to wonder if speaking up would make them the villain. She looked at her phone and saw that the video had millions of views. Her father's voice was still playing, but more significantly, people were listening. When people like him put you down, you don't just get back up. You make sure they never get the chance to push anyone else. She grinned, realizing that this wasn't just about her, but also about justice, and that this was only the beginning. In this circumstance, what would you have done? Would you have resisted, or would you have left? Leave a comment below with your opinions. And keep in mind that quiet permits injustice to persist. Speak up, stand up, and hold people accountable.